Finally, the fourth study is a cross-sectional study. So the rest of them have looked at change over a period of time. This is just looking at one point in time, how does your alcohol environment relate to your drinking behaviour? So there's a risk here, I guess, of spurious effects, but we try and control for more issues in this study. This is a youth survey that Victorian government runs of 16 to 24-year-olds. We combined the 2003 and 2004 waves of the survey to have a sample of 12,000 young people. And we broke them down into postcodes, the postcodes that they lived in. And rather than look at sort of the risky drinking that's defined in the NHMRC, we looked at kind of the very high-risk drinking, the things that people think of when they say binge drinking. They think of, say, 20 drinks for men, 11 drinks for women, and fairly regularly, at least once a month, the respondents reported doing this. And, I mean, first of all, we were surprised that up to 20% of drinkers in this age group report this behaviour, so it's not uncommon for people to drink like this. Because we had survey data, we'd asked the young people a range of questions. We could control for a lot more. We could try and make sure that the effects we're seeing here weren't due to some other effect, weren't due to the family's income, to the work status of the young person, to their age, their sex, to the way their family functioned and so forth. And we also incorporated some controls here for the kind of neighbourhood they lived in terms of poverty, the socio-economic status of the neighbourhood. So as I said, we controlled for a range of individual level variables, and a number of these had effects. So basically, the older respondents, those over 18, were more likely to do this high-risk drinking than the 16 to 17-year-olds. People who came from non-English speaking backgrounds were much less likely to drink like this. Young people who reported problems in terms of their family functioning were more likely to drink at very high-risk levels. If they lived with both their parents or had moved in with a partner, they were less likely than if they were living in a single-parent household or in a share house to drink in this heavy way. Leaving school, having left school to work or to study elsewhere was positively associated with risky drinking, even controlling for age, so there was an effect beyond the age effect. The more disposable income a young person had, the more likely they were to drink at this high-risk level, and the younger they first started drinking, the more likely they were to drink at this very high-risk level. So those were the sort of individual factors. There was no effect of the socio-economic status of their neighbourhood, so it didn't matter if you lived in a rich neighbourhood or a poor neighbourhood, it didn't affect your drinking behaviour at this very high risk end. People living outside of Melbourne, in rural and regional areas, were about 30% more likely to report this kind of drinking than those living in the urban areas of Victoria. And there was a significant effect here for packaged liquor outlet density, so number of bottle shops in the neighbourhood. Basically, the more bottle shops in your neighbourhood, the more young people reported drinking at this very high risk level. And just to try and give you a sense of the effect size, we imagine a hypothetical postcode that had 1,000 16 to 24-year-old drinkers in it, resident in it. Each additional bottle shop in that neighbourhood would be linked to around 6 extra young people drinking regularly, 20 plus or 11 plus, depending on their gender. So, trying to sum it all up here, it's clear that deregulation of liquor licensing was sort of a government project through the 70s, 80s and 90s in Victoria and beyond. In general, the focus of the reviews and the legislation was to foster competition, to boost economic development. A number of the reviews called on the people doing the work to focus on the effects on tourism, for example, as one of the key kind of findings, and employment. So really it was an economically driven process. And it led to substantial changes in the industry. It led to a huge growth in the number of outlets, and it also, which we haven't analysed here, led to a great expansion in the hours that these outlets could trade. What we've seen at a state level is that these increases have occurred at the same time as large increases in rates of population harm. And then I presented a number of specific studies here that demonstrate that we can be reasonably confident there's a causal link here between the changes in availability and these kinds of harms, the high-risk drinking, chronic disease and violence in Victoria. Studies from elsewhere have shown, the study from Newcastle that was referred to this morning, have shown that changes to trading hours are important, and Victoria has seen a great expansion in trading hours, so no doubt that's contributed to harm increases as well. In terms of a policy response, I mean, I've talked so far about the kind of economic focus. There's been some evidence recently, the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe, that government's starting to realise that this is a problem, that they've got to think about ways they can deal with these issues around alcohol-related harm. So there's been more focus in liquor licensing policy about combating harm as well as facilitating the industry. Not always the most effective ways that they've gone about it. There was the trial of the lockout in Victoria a couple of years ago, which was a 3 o'clock, I think, or 2:30 lockout of all premises, that about 150 of the late trading venues got an exemption from when they took it to court, so it was ineffective. There's been a shift in the way liquor licensing is managed by the government. A new agency called Responsible Alcohol Victoria was created in 2008. That's brought with it a civilian squad of licensing inspectors who go out and make sure that premises are fulfilling their obligations. Last year, the year before maybe, there was a change to fees to try and make premises that had higher risk pay higher fees. So if you traded late, if you had a high capacity, if you had previous breaches, you paid more for your licensing fees than if you were a small venue, closed at 1 o'clock, didn't have any prior history. That was controversial. And there's been some recent amendments to planning and licensing regulations to allow local governments to consider this idea of cumulative impact of premises when they're making their decisions. So they can't look at a new premise and say, this premise will be problematic because the owner's a dodgy guy or it's located in a bad position, but they can say, we already have 15 pubs in these 2 blocks, a 16th is going to cause these kinds of problems in terms of the overall effect. So there's a sort of shift to acknowledging these issues. And really a lot of this has been driven by pressure from local governments who are really, in Victoria at least, really feeling this as an issue and have struggled with their limited powers to combat it at their local area. I'd like to say that it's all been driven by our wonderful research. It's more likely that these responses have been driven by the focus in the media on nighttime violence. It's been a huge story in Victoria over the last 3 or 4 years and elsewhere, I'm sure, particularly about nighttime violence, so really focusing on the late night stuff. And in general, the options that have been tried, with the exception probably of the lockout, have been those that don't interfere too much with the market. So they try and shift the way fees are paid a little bit or alter some penalties for breaches and so forth. But policymakers are cautious about unintended consequences, basically. The lockout was a controversial failure for the last government, and there was a huge backlash here when one of the famous music pubs had to close down for various reasons that coincided with the new fees. That government became quite cautious about risking the ire of the industry or the community. And so more and more there's a focus on sort of cracking down on bad apples, so bad premises, bad individuals. People can be banned from entertainment districts now for misbehaving. There was a call recently for people to have their licences stamped with a red D if they had misbehaved in nighttime premises. I mean, I don't think that's going anywhere, but that kind of focus more and more on the bad apples than on the general community is kind of where policy seems to be headed. And in general, the focus has all been about the nighttime economy, about late trading, about nightclubs, about violence. Chronic disease hasn't really been a focus at all. Domestic violence hasn't really been a focus at all. There is some hint now that packaged liquor is back on the agenda. The new government has proposed requiring bottle shops to get planning approval. Previously they opened like any kind of retail outlet without requiring planning. So there's some shift maybe that there's some attention being paid to bottle shops. But the basic story is, and it's a tough story, is that policies that are going to reduce harm are policies that restrict the alcohol industry in some way. They're challenging to develop. They have a range of unintended consequences and they are going to offend some key stakeholders in government and the community. But they have substantial evidence behind them. Any government serious about reducing harm from alcohol has to think about policies like these that limit availability of alcohol in the community. Thank you.